Good afternoon, my name's Chris Billing. I'm Director of Major Business at Total Gas and Power. And when we say major business, that's actually I&C, the industrial and commercial sector. I'm also joined today by my colleague Matteo Nanelli, who works in our new ventures department over in Paris, and he'll be speaking later on as well. So firstly, thank you very much for attending. Over the next sort of half an hour, I'm going to give you an overview of energy technology in terms of where we have been, where we are now, and maybe a bit around what the future looks like going forward. The one thing I will say is that I'm certainly not a futurist by any means. I'm not trying to predict the future, but there are some things in here which hopefully just provide a bit of stimulation and food for thought as we go through it. Okay, so to kick off, I think it's worth recognising that 10 years ago, the energy market was very different, whether you're a supplier or whether you are an energy buyer. For example, if you go back 10 years ago, there were around 8 B2B energy suppliers, and there's somewhere in the region of around 35 now. There were also around 15 to 20 TPIs 10 years ago, and now we estimate there are around 300. Ofgem reckon there are somewhere in the region of over 1,000 TPIs. Green energy itself, green power, was relatively scarce, and it commanded a premium of around £2 a megawatt hour. These days it's obviously a lot cheaper. And the decision that people were making as an energy buyer was very much around whether shall I go fixed or shall I go flex. And of course now that's more of a hygiene factor in all of the discussions that we're having. There were also no conversations about how we make money from energy. That's changed a lot. And in the main, CHP was the only on-site generation. Solar was around, batteries certainly weren't around, and on-site generation has changed fundamentally. Customers didn't really have the ability to understand their consumption. If you look at consumption data that's available these days and the software portals that are out there, you can get some very, very good granularity in terms of how you actually consume your data, consume your energy. And we talk about the energy trilemma, which was securing energy supply, both from an affordable, low-carbon perspective, and making sure that the security of supply is there for the future. And again, the energy trilemma was never talked about years ago. And conversations with the finance director 10 years ago were very much around how much is this going to cost me? How much is my energy going to be? And now the conversations are very much around payback periods, interest rates, and things that we wouldn't have expected. So if we just have a look at the fuel mix 10 years ago, you can see on here that 10 years ago, pretty much a third of our fuel mix for our power consumption in the UK was coal, a third was roughly gas, and a third was nuclear. Renewables 10 years ago only made up 2% of the overall fuel mix. And this was very much at a time where small-scale renewables were considered very expensive. And also, when you look at nuclear, if there was an outage on any of the nuclear plants, we saw quite high price spikes, which were caused due to the fact of there being a lack of supply on the grid. And whilst coal-fired stations, actually on there says 29%, which was the general mix, at times, if gas prices were high, coal could actually represent up to 50% of the UK fuel mix at any one moment in time. So if we go forward and we look at what that's like now, so this is Q1 in 2016. Considerable change there in terms of renewables. Renewables within the UK now represent 25% of our fuel mix. And as we know, renewables capacity has grown in the UK significantly by around 85% over the last 10 years. And renewable installation, the capacity available, is actually 30% of all capacity in the UK. What I do also think is quite interesting is that if you look at the end of the first quarter of this year, the actual increase in renewable electricity has increased by nearly 12% versus 2015. So again, the increase we're seeing now is significant in terms of the way that we are changing our fuel mix in the UK. Wind and solar have very much played their part within this. We've seen growth on average of 23% on wind and 50% on solar within the last 10 years. And if we look at it from an international perspective, last year there was global investment of around $330 billion in the renewable sector. That's actually 6 times the investment in 2004. If we also look at it from an international perspective, we often think of China as having dirty old coal-fire stations, which isn't true anymore. China is actually leading the way in solar PV. Around 19% of total installed capacity in the world is actually led by China. Germany comes in around 17%, the USA at 11%, and the UK around 4%. So if we think how far we've moved just in 10 years, we've gone from renewables being 2% of our overall fuel mix to where we are now around 25%. We can only begin to imagine what the next 10 years look like. You may have, well, everyone's heard of the National Grid, but you may have heard or may not have heard of the National Grid energy scenarios, which were launched, I think they came out in around July this year. Now, National Grid have 4 scenarios where they look out to the future in terms of what they think the demand is going to be for power, and also where that is going to come from in terms of how those needs are going to be met. And as you can see here, this one's called Gone Green, and this is assuming that it's a scenario whereby policy interventions and innovation are very ambitious and effective in reducing greenhouse gas emission. As you can see, hopefully from the lines, there's a significant increase in solar generation and offshore wind. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, the International Renewable Energy Agency stated that offshore wind has the potential to grow from 13 gigawatts in 2015 to more than 100 gigawatts in 2030. So that's a 650% increase over the next 15 years. You can also see nuclear increasing very slightly, which is due to the go-ahead of Hinkley Point, which has been given this year. And you can also see coal scaling off from 2025, which is when the government announced that coal-fired stations in the UK to be closing down. The other point I'd point out on this graph is that you can see that demand is actually relatively static, if not falling, up until probably sort of mid 2020 to 25. Then it spikes up again. And the reason for that is that National Grid are expecting an increase in demand for electricity, mainly due to electric cars and heating and the way that we use electricity going forward within the UK. So again, quite a change. So we're going to have our sources of energy coming from a lot more renewables, but there's going to be an extra requirement for that actual electricity. But what I do want to do is sort of bring this back to technology a bit and step outside of energy for one moment. 10 years ago, these are the types of things we were very familiar with. I'm sure many of you recognise these, but we had separate devices for separate tasks, and our interaction with technology was a lot more physical than it was virtual. The words that we're all familiar with today, like cloud, apps, smart, and online, were very much a foreign language. If we go forward and we look at where we are now, we have converging technologies. So, for example, in one device now we have a TV, we have a Walkman and an iPod and a PC. Our mobiles now have 12 megapixel cameras instead of 1 megapixels. We have self-charging phone cases. We have Tesla driverless cars. We are Facebooking, we are Twittering, we are YouTubing, we are Instagramming. We have apps to boil kettles. We can order taxis online. And we have wearable technologies such as Fitbits and Apple Watches, touchscreen technology, fingerprint recognition, and I'm going to stop. The list goes on. I don't need to tell you. But these are the kind of developments that we really could not have envisaged 10 years ago. Why is this interesting? Why is it related to energy? Well, energy has very much played its part in this in terms of the batteries that sits behind a lot of these devices as well. And if you look at the new Google phone, which came out about a month or so ago, I think it's called the Pixel phone, it takes 15 minutes to charge your phone for around 7 hours of usage. It's things like that that make technology a lot more accessible. The other point is that technology itself can't be measured linearly. Its rapid growth really needs to be considered exponentially. So, for example, if we took a computer in the year 2001, and let's say that computer had 1 gigabyte of memory, that same computer in 2010 would have 512 gigabytes of memory. By 2020, they estimate that that computer is going to have around 524,000 gigabytes of memory. And by 2030, the memory capacity could be over a billion gigabytes for the same sort of size computer that we're dealing with. So the rate of technology, not just in the energy industry, but technology per se, is just increasing significantly. These could be our company cars of the future, who knows? But what I will say is this technology was envisaged in the 1950s. I mean, people were talking about this decades ago. But the point is that predictions of the future that were made early in the 20th century didn't always consider the consumer demand or base the prediction based on any trends. For as long as there is no demand for flying cars, there will not be a reason for technology to create them. It's as simple as that. Technology is perfectly able to invent these sort of things. We can invent these now. But we're developing technology where it's needed and where it's subject to priorities. The basic technology for solar has been around for more than half a century, likewise with batteries, but our usage now is very much due to the increase in demand, which has been driven by legislation, public policy, social needs, and the reducing cost reductions that we're seeing. The technology advancements that we've got in the UK, of which there are many, and this is the problem of doing a presentation like this, there are literally hundreds to choose from, but I wanted to pick up on a few. And the first thing is to state that 20% of the world's electricity is currently generated from renewable sources. Well, one example recently is actually one of our competitors, which is Dong, who have invested in a 300 turbine offshore wind project, which is about 90 kilometres off the Yorkshire coast. That's going to have a capacity of around 1.8 gigawatts, and that could meet the electricity needs of around 1.6 million homes per year. And the only reason they're doing this is because, of course, technology has advanced and the costs have actually come down significantly enough that they can make a good return on investment. The other picture there you can see on the right-hand side is actually a picture of what's called Western International Market, which is in Hounslow. This was a project initiated by the council where they invested £2 million to put 6,000 solar panels on the roof and 4 lithium batteries as well, actually within the unit itself. Now what happens here is that the actual market it operates at night time when it's dark, so they will use the solar panel, that's the energy from the solar panels created in the day, and release that via the batteries in the evening. So this is already happening. This type of technology is out there and it's available. If we look at some other examples of energy innovation, one is Gatwick Airport. I'm sure we've all heard of Gatwick Airport, but this is the first airport in the world to generate energy from Category 1 waste. And if you're not familiar with that, Category 1 waste is basically all the stuff that comes off the plane, the packaging, the boxes, the cups and everything else that we discard. That's costing the aviation industry around £500 million a year at the moment to dispose of. And actually by creating a new factory like they have done, a new plant within Gatwick, it's going to treat approximately 10 tonnes of this waste on a daily basis. It will have enough power to process the plant itself. It will heat the North Terminal at Gatwick, and it will also reduce water usage by around 2 million litres per year. Another example which I'm quite fascinated by is Nissan's hybrid car. Everybody's heard of Nissan Leaf, I'm sure. They're taking it one step further. They've launched a project earlier this year where 100 of their cars are undergoing a project to actually take the energy that that car has produced and sell it back into the national grid. So this is an example whereby you don't just charge your Nissan car. If you arrive home at the end of the evening and you have spare capacity, you have spare energy available, you can sell that back to the grid. So not only are we using it, we're creating it and we're selling it back in. Scotland's hydropower as well is another quite interesting one. I mean, the UK is actually sourcing 85% of its hydro capacity from Scotland, and the Scottish energy production is being boosted by around a £200 million hydro scheme on the Isle of Lewis. This particular project will generate enough electricity to power more than 200,000 homes. So again, another very much a growth area. Some people may call these twerky, but again, I find these quite interesting. Sewer fats, or fatbergs, as anyone's heard of them. So this is taking the fat from restaurants and from takeaways and various different places. and using that and sending it to a plant in Beckton in East London. And this is up and going, this is real. So they will transform the fat that's within the pipes, within the fat traps, goes to the plant, turn it into electricity, and that will produce around 130 gigawatt hours of electricity per annum, which is significant. Another example here is the Gogoro Smart Scooter, if anyone's heard of this. Not only, it's Tesla's answer to the scooter, I suppose. Not only is it fast, it will do 0 to 50 in about 4.2 seconds. But the actual, what I think is interesting is this is up and live in Taiwan. They have 220 of these battery swap stations, and the general concept is if you're running low on your power on your scooter, you don't have to go somewhere to charge it up. You literally pull up to one of these terminals and you swap your battery over and you continue on your journey. Now these actual stations themselves, as I said, you don't need to charge anything, but the stations can be installed within 30 minutes on site. It's literally off the back of a lorry and put it down somewhere. And there are 200 of these in Taiwan. It's starting to change the whole dynamics of the way that transport runs in Taiwan, and they're forecast to increase their global presence as we go forward. In the last 5 years, technology within the energy sector has picked up its pace, as I mentioned before, and of course, solar is one of those key areas. In the UK, the dramatic price fall in solar panels has already pushed PV almost to cost parity with planned gas-fired stations. So we're at a time now whereby the investment decisions of many utilities and organisations really needs to be considered quite carefully. Solar in the UK, you may be aware that in the last 6 months up until September this year, more electricity came from sunlight than it did from coal-powered fire stations. Solar generated nearly 7,000 gigawatt hours of electricity, which was about 10% more than coal, which was around 6,300 gigawatt hours. So already, just on our grid, we are seeing huge changes in terms of solar usage. Without doubt, many large organisations, and I'm sure some of you are investing in solar. Apple's investing not only in the US but also on a global basis. We have Google making investments of over £2.5 billion in the last few years, which also includes the financing of Solar City. IKEA has got around 700,000 panels on its stores, and Sainsbury's in the UK have over 100,000 panels on its roofs. So we're really starting to see a growth in this area. Solar capacity itself is obviously growing on a global basis, and one of the key reasons, as I mentioned before, is due to the actual reduction in terms of the production costs. And I just want to go into this in slightly more detail to give you a bit of a view. I don't know if you've heard of the experience curve, but the experience curve was originated from a chap called Bruce Henderson. He was the founder of Boston Consulting Group. And the basic premise of the experience curve is that every time the aggregate number of a product made doubles, the individual item cost falls by around 20 to 25%. So what I mean by that is, take an example that a manufacturer or producer produces 1,000 units, and let's say that costs £10 each. By the time 2,000 units have been made, the cost comes down by around 25%, so around £7.50. This holds true in many sectors. Probably the strongest examples are within semiconductors and also within hard disk drives. But one of the reasons as to why do these costs reduce so rapidly, one of the reasons is associated with what's called the learning effect. And the best example of that is really if you've been to IKEA and let's say you buy 5 items and they're all identical, it'll probably take you an hour to put the first one up, but by the time you get to the 5th one, you're doing it in 15 minutes. So that's the experience curve, which really speeds up the way that the actual production is made. This very much holds true for solar as well. The experience curve sort of evolved into what's called Swanson's law for solar. And as you can see, the cost of PV panels has fallen in line with the model from 1976 to today. So very much in line, and most analysts agree that the percentage has actually fallen to around 20% over the last 60 years. Within your bags, if you're interested in this, there's a book in there called The Switch by Chris Biddle. Really interesting book. It talks about the way that, from a global basis, how solar and batteries are starting to change the world that we actually live in. His prediction is that within about 30 years, we could be completely fossil-free within the world due to the reduction in costs of solar and within battery as well. But that's all very good. Cost of solar production comes down, but there's one very important point, and that's the cost of money, otherwise known as interest rates. So you need to be able to purchase this and be able to afford it. Interestingly, the actual levelized cost of each unit of solar electricity rises sharply for each 1% increase in the interest rate applied. So for example, if you were borrowing money for a solar farm in the UK, if you could borrow that money at around 3%, the cost of electricity would be around 4.7 pence per kilowatt hour. However, if the interest rates increased and you were paying around 10%, that cost could well be over 9 pence per kilowatt hour. So great production cost falling. How much is it going to cost me to borrow the money, which is really important. I'm not going to go into detail in terms of traditional PV and how that's changed, but I think it's just worth touching on the way that PV is changing on buildings. If you take an urban environment, so what I mean by that is any town or city, obviously there's only a limited amount of space where solar panels can actually be put up. Typical example is a skyscraper. You can imagine the Shard in London, if they wanted to put solar panels on there, probably only get 2 or 3 actually at the top. This could well be changing. There is technology out there now called building integrated PV. This is where the solar panel is actually an integral component of the building envelope, so the window itself. So it's a window solar panel. There are many examples out there starting to take off, and I'm not an advocate of any particular company, but if you do listen to them, they say that payback could actually pay for itself within around 12 months because the cost increase is only marginal as compared to a traditional window. So again, it's just another example of how solar is developing and how it could transform our overall energy requirements. Just another couple of examples as well. Smart walkways. You may have heard of paved Gentiles. Paved Gentiles were actually in the London Olympics. So this is the pedestrian walkway. You walk along and you actually transform that kinetic energy into energy and produce electricity. They did that in the London Olympics, and it paid for enough energy was produced to cover the use of the street lamps in the evening, also some other areas of the Olympic Park. But I think what is really interesting about this particular technology is that their first version that they launched in 2009, we go forward to where we are today, 7 years later, their latest version is 200 times more powerful than it was in 2009. So within 6 years, it's 200 times more powerful. So again, just goes to demonstrate the rate of technology. Another example I put up there is the Audi shock absorber, which Audi are working on at the moment. Again, converting the kinetic energy as we go over the potholes and the bumps in the road. They're saying that the recuperation output is typically between 100 and 150 watts, but if you go over a very bumpy road, it can be around 613 watts. So again, another example where we're just using energy that's typically wasted and converting that into electricity. As I mentioned before, I mean, there are absolutely hundreds of different types of technologies out there. It is worth just touching on when's the right time to embracing technology. It's a common issue, and there's no silver bullet for this. Nobody wants to invest thousands or millions of pounds to find out that it's outdated in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. By no means is this legal advice, but technology experts, this is quite a common framework that technology experts work to. They say that we should be considering these particular areas. So the first on here, business objectives. If your business is not sustainable in our world, if you don't have sustainability objectives, then any new technology case you put forward to the board is going to be evaluated on payback and cost of return. So therefore, it probably won't get enough legs. If you look at creating a revenue stream, and I touched on this before, it's about how do you make money from energy. So again, it's not just the cost of installing things like solar and batteries. Demand side response is out there. You can actually make money from energy now. competitive advantage, lower energy costs within your organisation can make your products and services a lot more attractive and make you more competitive. Government legislation, this is really a key one. Government legislation is changing all the time, as we know, and we've seen some good examples where the feed-in tariff was almost pulled away overnight, which caused massive disruption within the UK. It's really important, and it's not a case of just thinking and looking ahead to see whether an incentive is going to be withdrawn, but also, are there going to be new incentives coming on for the types of technology that I'm looking at? And also the cost of money that I talked about before, i.e. the interest rates. If we look at it in a more micro level, the installation is of course fine, but how are you going to finance the actual maintenance costs, and where's the resource going to come from? Are you going to do that externally, or are you going to do that internally? And there are of course further costs to that. It's not just your installation, your maintenance, it's legal costs, displaced resource costs. There's lots of other areas that need to be looked at. One thing worth considering are indirect benefits as well. So we might be thinking, okay, we'll put the solar on, we will be able to create our own energy, and we might be able to save a bit of money, but also we can avoid triad periods potentially. There's obviously the potential to look at how you can mitigate third-party costs, whether that's government taxes, whether that's distribution and network costs as well. And very importantly, technology evolution. Is this technology at its peak? So earlier I was talking about the experience curve, and if you are looking at any technology, try and find out a bit about where that technology sits on the experience curve. Is it following the same model that I was talking about earlier, where you'd expect a 20-25% reduction as volume actually doubles? Because that actual model holds quite true. Cost versus reward. This is really a business case. So if you're going to invest any money in terms of implementing new technology, you would do a business case. What I would suggest is you do a business case now, and you do a business case based on assumptions in about 2 years or 3 years' time. If you do that, of course you're working to assumptions, but that will give you a really good indicator as to whether or not your project is viable. And the final one on there, referrals. We all know that if somebody else has got it, then what we should really be doing is speaking to them and finding out what their experience is of it. So where are we heading? 10 years in the future or before? The Internet of Energy, there's many names for this, the shared energy economy, holistic energy, energy communities. I've heard of many ways this is described. But what we're starting to see is the convergence of energy and how it is created and consumed. And without doubt, procurement, buying at the right price, demand-side response, energy efficiency, it's all important. But we really do need to start to get our heads around energy convergence of the future. It's becoming a reality. Another example around this is Bristol City Council. So Bristol City Council, they made a fund available for new projects within the area. And one of those local projects that has got the go-ahead, it's small, it's run by Eastern Energy Group, and they're looking into setting up a microgrid across 2 streets. So quite simply, houses will have solar panels on them, they will also have batteries within the houses, and they're creating a grid between those 2 areas. So of course, that means that they can share the energy that they're producing amongst themselves. And this is the way things are changing. Without doubt, every person in the UK, every person in every building is capable now of not only just consuming energy, but also in terms of generating it as well, a fundamental shift. So where are we with government? What are government doing about this? There will always be government. Government will always be intervening, wrong word, making sure they're supporting the way we go forward with our energy system in the UK. You might be aware that last week there was a call for evidence that was issued by Ofgem and BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The call for evidence is very much around they're seeking input from anybody, whether you're a consumer, supplier, about what they think or what you think the energy system and network should look like going forward into the future. So this consultation, which is open at the moment, will end in January, and we expect a response in spring in terms of what they are planning to do. There will be a response in spring. I'm sure there won't be any firm policy or regulations or initiatives around it. There might be a few other consultations, but government is very much taking an interest in this space. Whether they go as far as what they're doing in California at the moment, the Californian government will incentivize installations of batteries by up to 90% of the cost, which makes the payback period around 2 weeks. Whether that remains with Donald Trump, we will have to wait and see. So hopefully that's a bit of an overview in terms of where we are with technology and a bit of food for thought. I would like to introduce you to Mathieu now. He's going to just spend 5 minutes explaining what Total are doing within this particular space. Mathieu.
Good afternoon. I'm Mathieu Laniel, working for Total Gas and Power based in Paris and focusing on new products and services. So following this journey through innovation, I will come back to the basics of how, as Total, as a oil and gas business, we can develop new energies and sustainable business. So it won't be about connected watches and flying cars, but rather how do we develop solar and energy efficiency services. Two important events this year. One is, maybe you've heard in the press, Total has bought Saft, which is a battery storage manufacturer. SunPower is a solar business which was bought in 2011. So this is a strong move towards renewables. Another event which is more oriented towards the internal organization is the definition and the rollout of a 20 years ambition in the renewable energies. And the purpose is to define the target and to frame a new organization to reach those objectives. I will say a few words about this new organization in the coming minutes. So the 4 pillars, just not entering in the details, the 4 pillars of this new organization, of this new ambition, is to offer an affordable energy under high safety and environmental standards, provide clients with solutions to use energy in a responsible way. Third one is to develop close to customer service. And the fourth one is to factor in our strategy the 2-degree scenario. And it's a direct consequence of the COP21 agreement in Paris. And just entering in the detail of how to achieve that at our company level, it's first reduce the carbon intensity, the footprint of our business. How do we improve our business? How do we reduce our consumption? So that's our homework. Develop renewable energies. It's about solar, it's about batteries. It could be about other energies, biomass. And improve energy efficiency and develop this as a standalone business and offer this to third parties. So this new branch that has been created this year, Gas, Renewable and Power, is about implementing that practically. So this branch is not starting from scratch. It's gathering different parts of the company, as gathering businesses that have been purchased. Clearly, there's an entry in the energy storage business. There is a historical gas and power trading business. There is a gas and power marketing business. And there is also a solar business. The idea of this new branch is to glue that together and to develop bundled services and not only verticals, but to have a consistent and bundled offer to the clients to address all their needs at once. So this is in the making, and the last part is Saft, which is a new part of the business and is focusing on battery storage. Just a few highlights on the figures. One key point of this One Total ambition is the target that is set, which is to have a 20% share of the low carbon business in 20 years. So it may seem a bit low, 20%, but we are starting with a very large turnover. The oil and gas business is quite large, so 20% is still a very significant amount of renewable business. So that's a target that has been set, and we are now organizing to deliver on those targets. clearly one of the way to reach the clients and to roll out this new supply and services offer is to go through the gas and power retail businesses. We are now operating in 5 countries on the B2C segment, and this year, mid-16, we entered in the B2C segment in Europe, starting from Belgium, where Total has purchased Lampiris. It's a Belgium-based retailer of gas and power, mainly focusing on B2C, and it also has a business in France. So we are entering in this new business of the B2C gas and power retail. And we can see that there are other areas of growth which are connected to the gas and power supply, how to charge electric vehicles. So these are offers that can be added to the traditional gas and power supply. Just one last slide to illustrate that this is entering into action. This is Saft, SunPower. We've just decided as Total to implement a $3 million plan to install solar panels on the roofs of the gasoline stations in 5,000 stations in the world. And this is a five-year plan. And yeah, it's a way to implement practically within our business this renewable strategy.
Thanks, Matthew. We're just about there. Just one final slide, really. I think technology is obviously inevitable, and hopefully you can see from the presentation that we've given today that I think the ways of creating energy are changing our world, and we very much need to look outside traditional methods. And I think, to be perfectly honest, I mean, everyone talks about an energy strategy, and we now need to start talking about energy technology strategies and how we embrace this within our businesses. But thank you very much for your time, much appreciated. Thank you.